Does your story need a genre? No. Your story needs clarity, and a context conveys this clarity. Genre, when framed, allow you to create a context. Now, how do you frame your genre in order to create a context? First, you need to define your target emotion, the emotion you want to convey. Then, you'll pick the corresponding genre. After this, frame this genre to create a context. And finally, refine your context by adjusting your frame. How do you adjust it? Focus on your main themes. Make use of characters and environment to create depth. Why restrict ourselves to 6 genres? Your stories need clarity, and for this you need a systematic approach. 6 genres will be enough to provide a balance between diversity and clarity. A clear system should also make improvisation simpler, so that you can create story more easily. The simplicity of the system allows you to develop story more easily, but also more in depth. Simple classification is also designed to factor the complexity of modern storylines. Most stories you will create are likely to fall into multiple genres as they evolve, especially if you intend to create a series or a saga. Therefore, 6 large categories are more likely to define your storyline than one narrow category. Now, what are your target emotions? Your story will convey emotions. It's the goal of your storyline, really. Either strong emotions, anger, fear, excitement, or deep emotions, sadness, contemplation, and courage. But it's really only a matter of long-term and short-term, between strong emotion being focused on the short-term, the immediate reaction, and long-term when it comes to deep emotion. Classifying emotion may be a confusing task. It is why you need a sturdy base. Here, one genre will correspond to one main emotion. But as you can see, there are many other subsets of this main emotion. For example, when it comes to adventure, the main emotion chosen here is excitement, but excitement can be subclassified as enthusiasm, wonder, or to some extent. For comedy, the main target emotion is joy, but it could be also requalified as happiness, and comedy also allows some kind of confusion when it comes to absurd, for example. In the case of action, your main emotion will be courage, which can be afterwards complexified and diversified into anger or pride. For drama, it's sadness as main and relief or gloom as secondary emotions. For saga, which is a genre we will define in a further video, the main emotion is pondering. Sagas or epics, long action adventure form, are made to contemplate the world, and they evoke some degree of remembrance. When it comes to horror, it's fear. Fear defines horror and can be then diversified into loathing, disgust, or hatred. All of the aforementioned emotions are considered as fundamental emotion. These are the emotions you'll want to target first, and from there you can extend. Combine genres to merge emotions. What if fiction was a pizza? Your story is the best, and your subsequent stories will be the best. Now, why the pizza parable? stories are scalable. Small stories are one-shot, medium stories or trilogies, and large stories are sagas. They are customizable. You can adapt and adjust them by adding or removing characters, items, and environment in congruence with the public's desires. They are shareable. Your stories are meant to be shared, and they are meant to be built with your team, with the public, and with the characters. Your stories are collective stories. You want to share them because they represent your ideal. You want to write them so that they taste delicious for you. And if they are delicious for you, the chances are high that they taste good for others. Now, what's this pizza parable? Your stories are scalable, they're customizable, and they're shareable. How does that translate into a fiction? Well, what's your dough first? What's the base of your pizza? Action-adventure or saga is one of the most prevalent, if not the most prevalent, genre in fiction. Action-adventure or saga is comforting, it's familiar, and it's flexible. It's the dough. Action is the spices. You put action in a fiction to put more punch in the fiction. Adventure is the herbs or the vegetables. You add them for more flavor and more freshness. Comedy, well, comedy is the cheese. Comedy is cheesy. Too much and you gotta boil into it. But, well, you need it to hold the rest together. Drama. Drama is your sauce or your cream. Too much drama and you can submerge all other genre. And horror. Well, horror is the meat of your story. Horror is delicious in moderation. Now, what's the point of this parable? The pizza parable allows you to start new stories more easily. If you don't know how to start with the dough. Action, adventure, or saga is your surest genre. Sagas are universal stories, compelling humans because they balance emotions. There's a sense of familiarity in saga. They're also the most flexible kind of stories. They're experimentation stations too, since they welcome so many genres, so many frames, and so many kinds of elements. If you're starting a story and you're not sure which genre to pick, start with a saga and create a place where the public wants to return. Sagas are homes. The dough is home. What are the most popular frames? Science fiction, fantasy, western, pirate, mystery, thrillers, monsters, and war. Why group this genre in this manner? Well, there's a lot in common between science fiction and fantasy, but mainly they are journeys. Science fiction and fantasies are often epics, and they are quite lengthy as well. There are some examples of short science fiction and fantasy stories, but most of the time they're less satisfying, as science fiction and fantasy need plenty of resources to be fleshed out. They need plenty of time, and generally these frames are more adapted to adventure or sagas, as these are intricately lengthy. Why group Western and pirates? Well, Westerns, pirates are criminal stories, rebelled stories, self-made man stories. The continuity of the pirate or the western genre is the crime frame. Most of the mafia stories originate in this idea of the self-made man and the rebellious figure which acts in contrary to the traditional legal model. Mystery and thriller are pondering type of stories. They generally require more intellectual involvement from the public and from the main characters as well. It's not difficult to group these genres together, these frames together. It's not really unusual as well. And it's so familiar, in fact, that mystery and thriller may be considered genre in some contexts. Monsters and war are two frames grouped by evil. They generally intend, even if they are combined with comedy, to show human beings' worst traits. The monster frame is often used as an allegory of what a human being can be. For example, the vampire frame in Monsters is supposedly used to represent aristocrats or humans that consider themselves superior to other humans. The cannibal type of monster type express the same kind of ideal. Those two monster frames can be easily combined with war. The beast type frame or the zombie type frame and mostly dystopian frames combine monsters and war as a unified frame to create a deeper context. How do you make use of these frames? Frames define your story's limits. They give the public a definition of what your story will be, and therefore offer the public a degree of predictability. The themes you use while refining your frame will be displayed and unfolding through your story. Framing a story allows you to create a context. Now, how do you frame a genre? You frame it by making use of the main themes of your story. If your themes are adventure, impermanence, and acceptance, you must make sure that the characters and the environments translate these. How do you make sure the characters and the environment translate these? By framing your story. You picked your genre, you will now frame this genre, and we'll do that in the three following examples. Each time you want to create a new story, a new scene, a new chapter, returns to your sixth genre and pick the genre which corresponds to the target emotion you want to create. Then frame it. If you intend to write a dystopia, you'll want to focus mainly on horror and saga. In the core of dystopia, there is fear, there is uncertainty, there is horror. You can add some action, you can add some drama. Your dystopia may benefit from it. You'll generally want to skip on the comedy part, except if it's to install a more diversified rhythm. You may want to create some instance of relief, but relief can be created through drama and action as well. So, comedy really isn't essential when it comes to dystopia. So is adventure. Dystopia are generally written in a limited space, which really opposed to adventure. Dystopias will most of the time benefit from claustrophobia. It's not always the case, but it's another layer of fear that you can add. Limiting resources of the character, and here namely limiting their available space, will make them more paranoid. It will make them more reactive. It will make them more tense and angst. Dystopia really benefits from added layer of fear. And as for saga, you want to stretch it to create more depth into the fear. A lengthy fear, a long-term, sustainable fear, which the character can remember at the end of the story and get a lesson from. If you want to write a romance, your two core genres will be drama and action, and therefore your two main target emotions will be sadness and courage. Romance can benefit from any of the other four genres in moderation, because really the core here is drama and action. You'll want to punctuate your romance with some comedy, with some adventure, to offer your public a diversity of dialogues, a diversity of environments. But romance will benefit maybe a little less from fear, because fear can be distracting. If you're writing a pulp, go for action and adventure. A pulp is supposed to be exciting. A pulp is supposed to be tensed. A pulp is supposed to be ridden by the short term. Your characters will take decision in the short term, almost exclusively. Pulp can be really highlighted by comedy. And so, pulp will often accept comedy as a third genre. It's less important than action and adventure, because for the action component, you will focus on the characters at some point, and for the adventure component, you will focus on the environment. So comedy doesn't really have a place in focusing on the character or focusing on the environment specifically. Generally, comedy will come from a mix of both. Situational comedy in pulp can be especially effective and reinforce the adventure dimension. And repetition comedy can be just as effective and reinforce the character focus dimension. Drama could and would, if used, add a sense of diversity to your pulp to give it more depth. Pulp really rarely benefit from horror because your characters are in control of the situation most of the time. Action and horror don't really go well together if you don't know how to balance them, because the action dimension puts the characters in control, where the horror dimension removes control from the characters. So it's safer, not exclusive, just safer to put action in priority here. As for saga, saga is not generally something to recommend to pulps, because pulps are better when they're short, when they're tensed, and when they're intense. As saga tends to stretch out stories, remember, saga is the dove, you will want to skip this dimension to keep a more packed story, a more intense story. How do you make use of context in order to create immersion? Context serves three purposes. It creates predictability and expectations. It allows the story to be more readable. And it creates a sense of familiarity and belonging. Combining genres and themes helps the public to immerse themselves into stories. Context deliver both coherence and consistency, which are both essential to develop your world. A genre and a frame create a context, and here are some other possible combinations of the aforementioned genres and frames. If you intend to combine action and science fiction in order to create, for example, a swashbuckler, how does it go? Well, swashbuckler will not be just satisfied by action. It needs other genre. Most of the time it will require some comedy. It may require some adventure as well, and maybe some form of drama. Now, is that enough to create a satisfying swashbuckler, and where does it come from? Swashbuckler is often the combination of the action genre and the pirate frame. Now, why the pirate frame and not the western frame, for example? Well, the pirate frame is more concentrated on the grandiose aspect of the story, where the western stories are often rougher. By combining an action genre with a western frame, you often get a wilderness context. Now, what does wilderness require? It may benefit from comedy, but it especially requires some form of adventure. It may require some form of horror, since now you're in an environment that the characters don't know. It may be lengthy and require some form of saga. But really that's up to the story you're telling. The inclination of the action genre is to get the most of what you're trying to create. Now, if we restart from there. What if you want to create a farce? Now, what's a farce? Farce is the combination of fantasy and comedy. Where does that leave us? And what do you need in a farce? Farces are often absurd, and they can therefore benefit from both drama and horror. Do you need some action in the farce? Probably. Do you want strong emotions? Do you need some adventure in a farce? Not really, because you can create them in a very limited setting with a very limited amount of characters. So they don't really need to be outside or in large environments, and they don't really need to be lengthy in any way. What if you want to create a burlesque now? What's burlesque? Burlesque is also a combination with comedy and another frame. In this case, it's mystery. So how do you represent burlesque? Just as for the farce, burlesque admits some form of absurd, so drama will be useful. Horror can be useful, but less than drama, since it can be distracting. Adventure, it's still not absolutely necessary, and so does action. Now, what's the effect of saga and the stretching effect of a saga on a burlesque? So, you have to answer one question to get the answer. Do you want to spend a lot of time in an absurd world? If yes, add the possibilities of saga, because you have the potential to create something deep and complex. If you try now something like espionage. Now, what's espionage? Spy stories, or mercenary stories to some extent, but let's figure out it's spy stories for now. Require a multiplicity of environment, so adventure is absolutely essential here. Some form of action will be required, and you may benefit from some comedy, but not much more than, for example, both burlesque and farce. Here, comedy is something to include in moderation, because it can be distracting. So is horror. You want to skip on horror in this case, because horror will be highly distracting. Should it be long? It can be a series, so you can add some saga. And does it need drama? Well, in most cases it does, because the implications of an espionage story are often large and in the long term. Now let's try another genre. What if you want to create a dark fantasy? But what's a dark fantasy? It's often opposed to high fantasy, and the two genres are treated in conflict. But they really depend on common symbols, common kinds of monsters, common kinds of settings, and common kinds of characters. Now, where is dark fantasy different from high fantasy? Well, dark fantasy often require a higher degree of horror and drama. Here you've got your two main genres. Dark fantasy tends to be more inclined to accept a higher degree of action, because here action is directly dependent on drama as well as horror. Now, what's the other difference between dark fantasy and high fantasy? High fantasy relies on adventure. So a high fantasy will need a lot of locations. Not to say that dark fantasy require a limited amount of locations. There will be a need for multiple locations, as in many stories, but the location will produce a very different effect. High fantasy opens the horizon. Dark fantasy closes it. And that's not to say that it closes the public or the character's perspective. They literally closes the environment. They restrict the amount of physical freedom. And therefore, they may allow for more reflection, more contemplation, and more pondering.